Welcome to DevOps Days Verona. Today we're going to talk about level up your DevOps with GitHub Actions and Kubernetes. I'm Rob Richardson. Come join us. Now here's the part where I open up the slide deck and we go look at all the things. There are no slides with this. Notepad, that's my one and only slide. But let's take a look at the code. Yep, here's the code. Well, kind of. This code is empty. We're going to go build up the code. We're going to live code today everything to build up a website, to add it into a container, and to publish it to Kubernetes. Come join us. Now this repository will be online. You'll get to see the code that we're actually going to build today. You can get to this from robrich.org. Click on presentations, and here's level up your DevOps with GitHub Actions and Kubernetes right here at the top. Click through to the code. While you're here on robrich.org, let's take a look about me and see some of the things that I've done recently. I'm a Microsoft MVP, a friend of Redgate. AZ GiveCamp is really fun. AZ GiveCamp brings volunteer developers together with charities to build free software. We start building software Friday after work. Sunday afternoon, we deliver that completed software back to the charities. Sleep is optional, caffeine provided. If you're in Phoenix, come join us for the next AZ GiveCamp. Or if you'd like a GiveCamp here in Verona or wherever you're connecting from, hit me up on email or Twitter, and let's get philanthropy installed in your neighborhood as well. Some of the other things that I've done: SQL Source Control Basics, minus Chapter 8, that was fun. And I worked on the Gulp team as a core contributor in version 2 and version 3. One of the things I'm particularly proud of is my .NET Rocks mug. I replied to a .NET Rocks podcast episode, they read my comment on the air, and they sent me a mug. Woohoo! So there's my claim to fame, my coveted .NET Rocks mug. So let's talk about leveling up our DevOps with GitHub Actions and Kubernetes. So we need to build some code. I have here an empty folder. I've opened up that empty folder in GitHub or in VS Code. Let's go scaffold out a website. .NET New. .NET New is really good at getting us to scaffolding out a website. Now we could have scaffolded out this website with Visual Studio or with VS Code, but let's do it from the command line. .NET New MVC. We'll give it a name of Level Up DevOps, and we'll output to the current folder. If we don't give it a name or an output, it will use our current folder name, which that works too. I love that not only is it building out the projects, but it's also scaffolding all of the pieces. So here's our website. We have controllers. Here's our home controller. We have views. Here's our home view. Homepage. Well, let's say, welcome to Level Up Your DevOps with GitHub Actions and Kubernetes. That's pretty cool. Let's add a README to this project. I'll create a new file and we'll call this readme.md, and let's go grab some content for that. For as much fun as it would be to watch me type that, there's a good README file. Okay, so now we need to add this to Git so that we can push it up to GitHub. Let's start out with a new file. We'll call this .gitignore. And these are all of the things that we don't want to push up to GitHub. This is all the built content, all of the dependencies, the libraries. Bin, obj, star.user, star.suo, the .vs folder. Depending on your project, you might need to exclude the node modules folder, the projects folder, a Maven build directory, the venv directory, specific to your project. Here in .NET, bin obj star.user, star.suo, and .vs is fine. We might also want to ignore star.log, etc. Okay, we've got our .gitignore. Now let's start building a mechanism of putting this inside of a container. Our first step to doing that is to build a new file, not open directory, new file, .dockerignore. Now this .docker ignore is exactly the same format as our git ignore. So in fact, let's go copy and paste that into place. Now the cool thing is if Docker doesn't find a .docker ignore but does find a .git ignore, it will use that instead, which in many cases is perfect. But we also want to ignore things like appsettings.development.json, appsettings.development.json, and also here inside properties, launchsettings.json. Now launchsettings.json is all of the information that we need to be able to debug this repository. Now, if we're building a production container, we don't really want to debug our app. So let's exclude that from the production container. Next up, we need a Docker file. Docker file. Now it's important that this be named Docker file and not dockerfile.txt. So if you did name it incorrectly by accident, rename, pull off the .txt, and now we've got Docker file. Yeah, it is possible to use another name, but Docker file is the default convention. So if you don't have another file, then, well, Docker file. And a lot of people approaching your project will go looking for a file named Docker file. So that's really a good choice. From. Well, let's go stand on the shoulder of giants and see what we can start out with. I'm going to come here to Docker Hub, and I'm going to search for .NET, and let's choose the .NET repository. Here in the .NET repository, we have a couple of different base folders, base repositories, depending on our use case. .NET SDK, that's the build tools. ASP.NET, that's the web runtime. .NET Runtime, that's for console apps or non-web things. .NET Samples is great if you want to take a look at lots of different Docker files and different use cases. Now we're going to need the SDK because we want to build inside of our container. So let's open up this repository and scroll down, and we want this one. We're using .NET 5, so we'll grab this repository. Scrolling down a little bit, we can take a look at the various tags or versions available in this image. And we can see the Docker files associated with each. Well, I know that Alpine is a really, really small Linux kernel, so let's use the 5.0-Alpine variant of this. Coming back in here from mcr.microsoft.com/.net/SDK 5.0-Alpine. Okay. Now here in a Docker file, there's really four main keywords. We looked at from. That's where we start with a base container, pulling in all of its layers, and then we begin from there. Now we want to copy in our content. We'll copy in all of the content from the build context directory, where we run our Docker build command, to the current folder inside of our container. Now what is that current folder? workdir/src. There's nothing magic about the folder /src, but it's a good place to put all of our content. So we copied in all of our content into this current directory. Now that's all of the content except for what we chose to ignore with our Docker ignore file. Now we need to run a few commands. .NET restore, .NET build, and we'll build in release mode. .NET test. We'll also build in release mode to be able to run our tests, and then .NET publish. Now this publish is not that unlike the right-click publish inside Visual Studio, but in this case we're doing it inside of a build file, so we'll know we'll get really consistent results. But it'll go harvest all of the details, the JavaScript files, the HTML files, CSS files, built DLLs, and it'll copy them here into this dist folder. Now we need to run these as Docker commands. So let's run this one, and we'll run this one, and we'll run this one, and we'll run this one. There. Now we've got all of those run as Docker commands. Now we do need a few environment variables and interesting things inside of our app. So let's go pull in some environment variables. This one tells ASP.NET to run in production mode and to start the app on port 80. We'll also tell Docker that we're exposing port 80, so it knows how to consume it. Then CMD. This is the command that will start up. Now we want to say .NET level up devops.dll. That will be the command that runs our site. Now right now that content is in the dist folder, so let's change our workdir to /dist. Now this Docker file is great. We could use this in production and it would do just fine. But it does have a few things that we can fix up. Right now, we have our build tools inside of our container. We have our source code inside of our container. And those are things that we may not want to put in a production container. And it makes their container bigger. Let's come back out to Docker Hub and let's look at other repositories. Well, we can look through, let's look at the .NET ASP.NET run image. Now we'll cruise down and we can grab that image URL. We'll also see here in the tags that there is an Alpine variant of this one as well. That's perfect. Let's split this container in half. And let's say from this, and we'll use the Alpine variant again. And now we have this second image. So this one, and misusing this term, is the production server. And this one is the build server. Now, yeah, they're containers, they're not machines, but we can pretend that. Here's the one that does all the building. Here's the one that does all the running. Well, now we need to be able to get this dist content into our workdir. Well, let's change this to app. We need to be able to copy that content into place. So let's copy. Now we want to copy from dist into the current directory, but in this case it would go looking for that dist folder on our home, on our host file system. We want to copy from equals build. Now there's nothing magic about build or app or source. It was just a convenient label. Well, where is that label? Let's name this one as build. Now we have a build stage. We could choose to name this one as production if we wanted to, or in this case, because we're not labeling it, we'll just leave it off. Now, as it goes to build, it will build this image. And when it finishes building this image, it will build this image. Now that's great. This is the one that will actually get tagged as we run our docker run command. And so this one will just be cached for our builds. Now, right now, there's another piece right here. If we're building this consistently and we just want to rebuild the things that have changed, right now we're copying all of our source code and then we're running restore to grab all of our libraries. So if I change an HTML file or a JavaScript file, I will restore all of my packages. I really want to restore my libraries before I copy in all the files. So I still need to tell .NET Restore what it needs to restore. Let's say copy level up devops.csproj into the current directory. Pardon me. And then we'll .NET Restore. Then we'll copy everything else, and then we'll run. Now, through the magic of Docker's layer caching, now this layer will get cached, and only if my csproj changes will it go grab those new libraries. Now, on my build server, I may choose to re-download the packages all the time to make sure I have fresh versions. But if I'm just running this quickly on my local machine, now that build will run much faster the second time. Great, we have a Docker file now that will create this multi-stage build so that our runtime will be as small as possible. And we'll only restore our libraries as often as we need to when they change. Now that we've got our Docker file and our Docker ignore file, we're ready to start committing this content. I'm going to come here into the Git part and I will say level up DevOps. And let's stage everything. Here's where I would spend a whole lot of time taking a look at the files that we've built and validating that the diff is as I expect. but in this case, I think we're probably good. Let's commit this. And now we've got that content ready to go. Git status. That's great. Git remote -v. I've already got this plugged into GitHub. And so let's git push origin main. Now that I've got that content up on GitHub, and we can see that we're already making great progress. Next, we need to go grab a Kubernetes YAML file. I'm going to go reach into the stash and grab the Kubernetes YAML file that I used last time. And let's set that in place. Now this Kubernetes YAML file is, it has the content that I created last time. So my service was named last time, all of the other content, and I want to change that with level up DevOps. Okay. So I can definitely go then tweak this. How many replicas do I need? What is the other content that I need? But I do have some runtime replacement variables that we can replace in the course of our build. What is our container registry URL? What is the image label? What is the host URL of Kubernetes? These are pieces that will start to swap into place in our production build. But now we've got our Kubernetes YAML file and we're ready to go. A deployment that specifies pod template, a service that will sit in front of that and load balance across all of the pods, and an ingress controller that will match the host name to the service. Okay, let's commit this one, add this one, add kdes.yaml. We'll commit that, and let's push that up to GitHub as well. Git push origin main. Okay. Now we've got all of our source code in place. We have the Docker file and the Docker ignore file to get our content into a container, and we have the Kubernetes YAML file that will allow us to start it inside Kubernetes. Let's go pivot and build up our DevOps pipeline. GitHub Actions is included with every GitHub repo, and there's a certain amount of free minutes that we get that's usually sufficient for most projects. Cruising through here, here's a Jekyll build, a Node build. We're going to build in containers. So let's cruise through here and see if we can find one that starts talking about containers. Docker. It's not a Jekyll one, but that is interesting. Docker image. Yeah, let's set up this workflow. Now we could definitely start with an empty YAML file as well, but let's call this Docker Kubernetes and take a look at the content that it builds. Docker build and push Kubernetes apply. So right now it's set up to run on main and only main. That sounds great. We probably don't want to deploy to production if you're pushing from another branch. We definitely don't want to push on pull requests. Let's come back to that. It's going to run on Ubuntu latest. That's perfect. And it's going to start out by checking out the content. Great. Now next we want to build and push the image. So in this case, let's run a script. And I'm going to run a multi-step script. We want to Docker build. Our file is named Docker file, so we don't need to specify that. We want to tag it, and we'll probably want to tag it as level up DevOps. And then we also want to reach in and grab the GitHub SHA. Well, I have created some secrets here in this repository. Let's come in here into settings and secrets. Now I went in here and I created some secrets. And so I just said new repository secret. I gave it a name and a value, and here's the names and values. ACR username and password, URL, AKS URL, and kubeconfig. So we can go reach in and use those. Here's the secret docs. And once we've created those secrets, now I can start to use them here with this $curly secrets dot that secret name. Back here in our build, let's do exactly that. Rather than just calling it level up DevOps, I want to call it secrets.acr URL / level up DevOps. And I also wanted to give it an image label. Let's call this github.sha. Now, that definitely isn't Semver, but it's very specific to this particular content. So if I change the source code, I will get a new Docker build tag. That's perfect. So I've built and tagged my content. Now, this will only tag that final build, the production build. The original image here in our Docker file, this original one won't get tagged. Only this final one will get tagged. That's perfect. Okay, now we want to Docker push this one. So let's go grab that name. Now, to push it, we'll first need to log into Docker. Well, into our Docker registry. Now, in this case, my registry is Azure Container Registry. And so let's go find a way to log into Docker. Log into Docker registry. Ooh. Docker login. Here we go. I'm looking for the Azure one. That's interesting. Azure Docker login. There we go. Now here in the marketplace, we can see the details associated with that particular one. Ooh, this one's actually different. Let me go look for the Docker branded Docker login. There we go. So I've got now the YAML that I'll need to add to my project to be able to do it. Let's copy that content and we'll set it here in place. Now I do need to indent it correctly so that I get the correct YAML details. And now let's dig into how we do this. So the first thing is we need to give it a registry. So we have this registry. We have secrets.acr URL. And then we need a username to log into that. Let's go grab secrets/acr username. And we need a password to log into that. And so let's go grab secrets.acr password. And do we want to log out at the end of the job? The default is true. Sure. Now this isn't at the end of this task, but rather at the end of this build. It's going to destroy the image, the VM that it built on anyway, so that's totally fine. Now that I'm logged into Docker, when I do a Docker push, it will head straight up to my container registry. Next, we want to do a kubectl. kubectl apply, and we'll apply this k8s.yaml file. Now, to be able to do a kubectl apply, we first need to log into our Kubernetes cluster. So let's come back to the marketplace and search for the plugin to be able to do a Kubernetes login. So Kubernetes set context. Kubernetes set context. That sounds perfect. Here's the YAML that we'll need to be able to set the context to log into our container registry. Or not into our container registry, but rather into our cluster. There we go. Make sure we've got our YAML lined up. Yeah, now we're ready to go. Okay, so here in this task, our first step is to pick the method. Now the default is kubeconfig, and that sounds perfect. Let's use a kubeconfig. We could use a context, a k8s URL, or a secret, but let's not use those. Let's use a kubeconfig. Now we do have a secret called kubeconfig. So let's go grab that secret and we will say kubeconfig. Now we're logged into Kubernetes. Perfect. Well, here in our Kubernetes YAML file, we did set some interesting things here. We have AKS URL and we have ACR URL, an image label. We'll need to replace those expressions in place. Now, one of the things that I'm going to do here is I'm going to put in this sed command. Now, sed can get a little hairy, so rather than watching me type, let's look at what this sed command is going to do. Now, first thing it's going to do, it's not going to back up. It's going to go look for ACR URL and replace it with secrets ACR URL. Look for AKS URL, replace it with secrets AKS URL. The dash or the /g, the global, so that it'll replace it in all of the spots. The image label, we'll put in our GitHub SHA, and we'll apply all of that in place to our k8s YAML file. Now it's important that we do this after we do the Docker build and push so that these secrets don't accidentally end up in the container. If I, for example, say, I don't know, forgot to exclude the k8s.yaml file from my Docker ignore. So because we've chosen to make this happen afterwards, even if that k8s YAML file did end up in the container, it doesn't have anything secret. That's good. So Docker build, Docker push, we'll replace those secrets, and we'll kubectl apply and send that up to Kubernetes. So Docker build and push, Kubernetes apply. Or maybe even more descriptively, do the job. Okay, so we start out doing a checkout. That's built in. We'll log into Docker. We'll grab our Kubernetes context and log into Kubernetes, build the image, push the image, replace all of our secrets in place, and run that and apply that into our Kubernetes container, our Kubernetes context. So start commit. GitHub Actions, build file, commit new file. Perfect. Now it's just another file in our repository. So if we come back in here and git pull, if we need to make changes, we can either make changes there in the designer inside GitHub, or we can just come here into VS Code or our editor of choice and make some changes here. That's perfect. Now, because we have a file here in the .github/workflows folder, if we come back here, we will see that a build has kicked off. Let's click through to that build and look at the details. Now it's going to do each of those tasks. It will check out our code, Docker login, Kubernetes set context, and now here we're going to do all of our tasks. It started up doing the Docker build, and so it's going to go pull all of the content, do our .NET build, .NET test, .NET publish, and ultimately now it's getting ready to push that content up to our Docker container registry. Once it's got that content in the Docker container registry, it's going to set that content in place. And now we have that content in Kubernetes. So kubectl config use context. Let's get to our Kubernetes context, kubectl get all. And we can see now, here is our content running inside of Kubernetes. That was really cool. Now it does take a little bit for this, it does take a little bit for DNS to propagate to get our content, our DNS settings into place. So let's proxy our way in. We can proxy into a pod or into deployment, And in this case, we can proxy into a service. Let's do that. Let's kubectl port forward service / level up DevOps 8080 into port 80. So port 8080 on my local machine will go to port 80 inside that service, just in case I have something else running on port 8080. So now let's come to localhost 8080, and we can get to that website. Welcome to the website. We scaffolded it, we built up a build and deployment pipeline, and we were able to send that off. That's really cool. Now, one of the things that we looked at was, well, we didn't do anything for any other branches, and we specifically didn't do anything for pull requests. Let's take a look at that. Well, right now here in this Docker Kubernetes, we have all of the things for the main branch. Let's create one for pull requests. Docker pull requests.yaml. Okay, we can start with all of the details that we had right here. Let's set this in place. Now, in this case, we probably don't want to push, and we don't want to send it up to Kubernetes. This is just a pull request. So let's just Docker build. And we're going to do everything on not main. So any branch that isn't main. And we'll also do pull request to any branch. Great. So this build will kick off when you do a pull request. Oh, I forgot branches. There we go. This build will kick off if you do a build to any branch that isn't main, or a pull request to any branch at all. Now, in this case, we don't want to apply that into our production Kubernetes. We might want to apply it maybe to a test Kubernetes. And now that we don't have a kubectl apply, we don't need to log into Kubernetes. So let's delete that part too. And we probably don't need to change our secrets since we have no Kubernetes YAML file to change them to. And we probably don't want to push that into a container registry, so let's delete that. Now that we're not pushing it to a container registry, we can remove the Docker login piece. And do we need to even reference this secret? Now we know for sure it won't end up in our container registry because we don't even have the container registry URL set. This is the perfect build for pull requests and for non-production branches. We're just going to build it in place and deploy it nowhere. Now, like any file, we can choose to add this file. Oh, hey, we finally remembered to set that Kubernetes YAML file in place. Now we won't end up with that in a build. And wouldn't it be cool if here on our homepage, we could have a badge that would talk about, you know, what did we do? Did we succeed? Is this build green? Let's go back into GitHub Actions and take a look at that. Here in GitHub Actions, we can go into a particular build and we can go grab the status badge code. Now the cool part is it already has crafted the markdown that we'll need. So let's go copy all of that status badge content, come back into our README, and let's paste that into place. Here's the README for this repository, and let's put it right there. So right after the title, before the subtitle. Coming back into our source control, let's stage that one. It looks like I've changed my README, I've changed my Docker ignore, and I've added a brand new build. Add PR build and status badge. Check. Now I'm going to push this, git push origin main. I will push these changes to the main branch. And because I've pushed these changes to the main branch, we'll see that right away a new build kicks off. Now this new build, we can see it either right here, or we can come back into Actions, choose our particular build, and we see the build running. Let's take a look at what this build is going to do. Now, last time, it was mostly done by the time that we got here. It did a Docker login, a Kubernetes set context, and now it's going to do the steps. The first step, it needs to pull down the base image. Looks like it's got that in place. Now it's going to do our .NET build, .NET restore the NuGet packages, .NET build. Let's see, is this build going to succeed? Yep, that build succeeded. That's great. Let's run all of our tests. Ooh, it looks like since we had no tests, all of our tests succeeded. We did a publish, and now we're all in our production container. That production container will set all of the environment variables that we need and ultimately get that ready to publish. We've got that published and sending that up to our registry, and then we'll do a kubectl apply, and we've got that new version in place as well. Now that's perfect. We can come out to our website and we can see that new version that's in place. We now also have this new build for pull requests or for non-production runs. So if I'm doing a release, if I'm on the develop branch or I'm building a feature branch, we don't want that to deploy to production. Now maybe we do want it to deploy somewhere else, so we can create a new build file that will do all the similar things. Now maybe this only runs on the develop branch, and instead of logging into the kube config here, we'll log into the dev kube config. So let's go build one of those. New file, and this will be docker develop.yaml. We'll start with this build and we'll set this in place. Now, we want to do exactly the same tasks. In time, we might choose to take these out and put them, I don't know, into a build.sh. That might be pretty interesting. Now we don't need to duplicate them in all of the places. They're still referencing all of the secrets, and so that might be kind of interesting. Now in this case, maybe we need to reference them as environment variables instead of as secrets here. So let's switch this over to an environment variable. ACR URL. And the GitHub SHA. And my ACR URL. And the GitHub SHA. And we could wander through the rest of the script making those adjustments to use those environment variables rather than the secrets that we had here. Now we could, instead of running that whole script, we just say run build.sh. Now, maybe it doesn't make sense to have it in the root folder. Maybe we want to put it here in the workflows folder, and that's fine too. But this one is to develop. So this will be only on the develop branch. And we'll do all of the normal things, but in this case, we want to say develop ACR URL and develop ACR username and password. Or even better, we can come to GitHub Actions or GitHub Settings, and we can create environment-specific settings. Now, if we chose to make environments, we can now link these to particular branches, and these settings will only be available for that branch. In time, we may choose to move these ones from being the default to only part of the production branch that is tied to the main branch, or the production environment tied to the main branch. So creating an environment defined for the develop branch tied to the develop pre-prod environment could be really interesting. And then we wouldn't need to change this at all. At that point, if we're using that, rather than building a whole new develop file, we can just come back in here and say, this one goes for main and develop. Nice. Here in our pull requests, we probably want to say not main and not develop. And I believe the syntax is actually like this, but I may be wrong there. And so now we have one build file that is able to accomplish both things just based on different environment variables. And it'll publish the same thing to the different Kubernetes clusters and different container registries. So the cool part here is we're able to use GitHub Actions to do all of our building and deploying and pushing this up to Azure. Now in this case, we chose to push it up to Azure. But if we come back in here into our build action, there's nothing here that is specific to Azure. That's pretty cool. Let's come back in here and edit it, and we'll come back to the designer. We're doing a Docker login to a Docker registry. If this registry was up on Azure, we would hook to Azure Container Registry. If this was up on Amazon or on Google, then we would push to the container registry there. Or if we're running locally, we could run to our local container registry. We're logging into Kubernetes. We're not logging into a particular cloud. So as we log in, we could log into the Kubernetes in Azure, or the Kubernetes in AWS, or the Kubernetes in GCP. And these build steps are not cloud specific either. We could deploy this to an on-prem thing, or we could deploy it to our cloud at Red Hat or at IBM. Ultimately, these details are not cloud specific. They are container specific and cloud agnostic. That's really cool. Now we saw our build run, and that was really cool. Let's come back to our README and see if we've got that content. Yes, there's our build badge. Nice, our build is passing. Now the cool part about this is that we built this repository up from scratch. You can definitely take this code, fork it, and use it in your own project, or you can dig into this type of mechanism and build a DevOps pipeline for yourself. Now, nothing was really all that intense for us. We were able to build up a DevOps pipeline to deploy a website to Kubernetes really easily. Now you can take this and run it in your environment. I would encourage you to build up a DevOps pipeline, create that automation so that you can have consistent builds in your environment as well. Thanks for joining us for this conference. I'll see you in the Q&A spot designated for the conference. Or if you're watching this later, hit me up on Twitter at Rob_Rich and grab the code that we just built right here up on GitHub. Thanks, everyone.